I'm surprised that Jenny isn't sitting with you. She replied, No, she's over there with her admirer, Bert. He's my bodyguard, so having him and his mate hanging around Jenny is good cover for them. You think he fancies Jenny then? Either that, or he's a damned good actor. You don't see a smile like that on a cop's face very often. Does he know that you're sleeping with her? Oh, don't look so surprised, John. I wasn't born yesterday. Well? I spluttered. Don't worry about it, John. I'm cool with it. You've been locked away from women for some time. In a way, it's a relief. From what I've been told, some guys turn a little, ambidextrous after they've been inside for a few years. Well, I'm not one of them. Calm down, John. I never said you were. I just said that it's nice to be reassured that you weren't, that's all. Anyway, down to business. Frank says that you should show up near Curtis' office around 9:30. Apparently he does a regular morning run, then stops for breakfast in a cafe, and returns to his house, office, or whatever you call that dump he lives in around 9:40. Once you are sure he's seen you, come back here. I was leaning under the bonnet of my car, pretending to be doing something to the engine when Curtis turned up. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he kept taking quick glances in my direction. Once he was inside the office, he kept looking out through the blinds. I decided not to leave right away, but hang it out for a while to make him sweat. It was about 10:15 when I left to return to the hotel. Someone, we assume it was Curtis, rang reception and asked whether you were staying here, Bert said when he joined Helen and me in my room just after I got back. He entered from Jenny's room, so I assumed he had a key, because Jenny was still downstairs in the lounge. Did they tell him? Yes, the guy working on reception with the girl is my partner. We need Curtis to think he knows everything. Suddenly Bert's mobile rang, and he went into Jenny's room to take the call. He was back within a couple of minutes. Curtis has gone mobile, heading out of town. The boss, I assumed he was referring to Gary Harris, said he left his place like he had a bullet up his arse right after you did. He tailed you for a while, probably to make sure you were coming back here, then made off up the London road. The boss is hoping he's heading for wherever Simmons is living. For the next 2 hours we heard nothing. Bert had returned downstairs and Helen and I sat and talked, mainly about her and my own children. She told me more about how she discovered that her husband was having an affair with his PA, and how it must have been going on for some time before she caught on. Then Helen and I went down to have some lunch. It was whilst we were eating that I noticed Bert take a call on his mobile. Straight away, from his body language, I could see that it wasn't good news. As we finished the meal, Jenny, who was also giving out bad vibes, caught my eye and then looked up. I gathered a parley was required in my room. Helen and I left the restaurant first, and we were in the room when Jenny arrived on her own. They lost the bugger in that bloody one-way system in Richmond. Frank told Bert that they were positive he was heading for wherever Simmons and Angela are staying, she told us. Are they sure he didn't spot them? I asked her. Yeah, from what Frank told Bert, they just got hung up in the traffic. Richmond can be a real pain in the backside sometimes. Well, in that case, Curtis might have just been going on a job. No, he has nothing in his diary for today, and no one called him this morning, Jenny replied. How the hell would they know that? I asked. Gary and Frank have been flying pretty close to the wind on this one, John. Helen said they've bent the rules a bit. So please don't ask how they come by the information they have. They could both be for the high jump if they get caught. Wow, the oh-so-correct Inspector Harris bending the rules, commented. Don't sound so sarcastic, John. I told you Gary and Frank really want to get Simmons. Helen scolded me. No, they want to be sure they put the right man away the first time. They might be bleeding pissed off that they could have been hoodwinked, but I'm damned sure they would both prefer it if it turned out that they were right when they put me away. Damned shame they are going to be disappointed. You know you're a cynic, John. Has anyone ever told you that? Helen sounded slightly annoyed. What do you expect? I've just spent 7 years cooling my heels in prison because those buggers didn't do their bleeding job properly. Well, believe it or not, they are sticking their necks out for you now. So please try to be a little appreciative, Helen said, and then we both dropped into silence. I'm pretty sure Helen was angry with me over how I felt about Gary and Frank. But for 7 years, I had thought they railroaded me into prison. You don't lose that kind of hate in a hurry. I must admit it was a boring afternoon. Ever if I was sitting in my bedroom with, in my opinion, a beautiful woman. Pity we weren't in bed, but I thought Helen's affections were directed elsewhere. We watched the TV and drank endless cups of coffee until about 7 o'clock when we started talking about going down for dinner. Helen had just gone into Jenny's room so that I could have a shower and change when she came back with Jenny and Bert, my so-called bodyguard. It appeared to me that he was Jenny's bodyguard. Actually, that was unfair of me, since the plan was for me to look like I was alone except when Helen was around. Jenny was good cover for Bert. Probably I was getting jealous. The boss thinks something is going on, Bert said as he entered the room. They found Curtis's Mercedes parked in a side street near Twickenham Station, but there's no sign of him there. So what does that prove? I asked. Well, someone stole a Mondeo Gia from a car park in Richmond 2 hours ago. That's 2 stops on the train from Twickenham. And guess what? That Mondeo is parked in the station car park just down the road at this minute. One of the local guys just spotted it. So what happens now? There's no one in the car, so Inspector Harris thinks that the driver is watching the hotel waiting until you go out somewhere on foot. Then he thinks the driver will retrieve the car and try to knock you down. Both the other hit and runs were pretty late in the evening, so our man's quite patient. But there's nothing to worry about. We've got men watching the car. When the driver turns up, we nick him. I can't see what good that's going to do. If it's Curtis and he was intending to run me down, you can't prove he was intending to kill me. You'd better tell Harris to let him have a go at me. Are you mad, John? He could kill you. Jenny shouted. Jenny's right, John. It's too dangerous. Helen joined in. I don't think the boss would go for it anyway, John, Bert added. Then I can't see the point in this whole charade. Ring Harris and tell him I said he's to get his boys to stay back until the attempt is made. It's not like I don't know what's coming. Harris can call me on my mobile and tell me when the car moves. I'll be waiting for the little bugger. Bert called Harris, and at first he wouldn't go for it. But then I took the phone off Bert, and, after a lot of argument, he agreed that my idea was the best but extremely dangerous. After I made a dig about spending the last 7 years with a load of psychopaths, Harris relented. But he said if I got injured, it would be down to me. I didn't eat dinner with Helen at the hotel. Instead, I walked to the White Hart, a public house about a quarter of a mile away, and had a meal there alone. There was no sense in putting anyone else in danger. The plan was for Bert and his oppo to drive to the pub so that they could watch what was going on. But when they arrived, they had Jenny with them. We didn't acknowledge each other and sat on opposite sides of the bar. The place was pretty crowded, and a couple of times during the evening people had to share my table. One guy actually struck up a conversation with me, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. By 11 o'clock, they wanted to close up the pub, but Harris hadn't rung to say the car had been moved. So I went into the gents and called him. It looks like a no-show, John. You might as well give up and go back to the hotel, Gary suggested. As I came out of the gents, I could see Bert talking on his mobile, so I guessed he was talking to Gary or Frank. Bert and my eyes met for just a second, and that told me he knew I was about to walk home. We couldn't communicate just in case someone was watching me. They actually finished their drinks and left the bar before I did. When I got outside, I could see the 3 of them standing by the car talking. To my mind, no one watching would have suspected they were police. I began the walk home along the deserted pavement sidewalk. I suppose I'd gone about 50 yards when I heard what I assumed was Bert's car start up, but I don't know why I knew that something wasn't quite right. Then it struck me that the vehicle, which I was only hearing, remember, as it was behind me, began to move, but it didn't reverse. Bert would have had to reverse his car to get it out of the car park. By now the sound of the car was getting louder, too loud. That thing's moving, I thought to myself. Then a car horn sounded in the distance, and I realized that Bert had seen the car that I could hear. I turned on my heel just in time to see the car that had no lights on mount the curb. It was maybe 15 or 20 yards away and coming straight at me. As I turned, I realized there was nowhere for me to go. A blank wall beside me with no doorways or anything to dive into. Any second now that car was going to hit me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I got friends in low places. The car was maybe 15 or 20 yards away and coming straight at me. As I turned, I'd realized that there was nowhere for me to go. A blank wall beside me with no doorways or anything to dive into. Any second now that car was going to hit me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I'm not sure whether it's the sudden burst of adrenaline hitting your brain that causes it, But in situations of danger like I'd suddenly found myself in, everything appears to go into slow motion. I could see the car coming straight at me. I can even remember thinking that I couldn't see who was behind the wheel because it was so dark. Just for a millisecond, the thought that I could dive to the side, just before the car struck me, entered my head. But at the same time, I realized that this wasn't an accident. The driver could just turn the wheel slightly and run over me whilst I lay on the ground, or even stop and reverse the car over me. Where the hell I got the idea of jumping over the damned car from, I really don't know. But as the car got close, I took a step or two towards it and then launched myself into the air. Then things get a bit hazy in my memory. I'm pretty sure I landed one foot on the bonnet with the intention of pushing myself higher, but the car was traveling so fast that I was thrown into somewhat of a spin. I can remember striking the car's roof with my shoulder and rolling onto my side, then slipping off the rear end of the roof and bouncing off the boot lid as I did so. The next thing I was aware of was laying on the ground looking up at Jenny crouching over me. "John, how badly are you hurt?" Jenny asked, with a very concerned look on her face. I can remember lying there wiggling my toes and fingers. Everything appeared to work as it should do, but I knew I'd given my shoulder one hell of a bang somewhere along the way, most likely when I first hit the car's roof. I was aware of nothing that appeared to be broken. Carefully, I lifted myself to the sitting position, with Jenny trying to persuade me to stay lying down. "Christ, Jen, I think I got away with it," I said to her in astonishment. "You know, for a minute there, I thought I was about to meet my maker. Where's Bert?" "They went after the car that hit you." "Ah, here's the ambulance now." "I don't need an ambulance. I'm fine. Just a couple of bruises, that's all." "John, you were unconscious for about 5 minutes, and you've got a nasty-looking bump on the back of your head. You're going to casualty whether you like it or not." Jenny was definitely in mothering mode, and I really wasn't in any condition to argue with her. There is also the possibility that I passed out again, as the ambulance ride is a very hazy memory. The next thing I remember, I was in casualty. I expected Harris or some other police officer to turn up in casualty, but for a long time, the only people I saw were a couple of part-time specials and Helen. Jenny, of course, had come in the ambulance with me. Poor Helen had trouble getting past the specials until Jenny had intervened. So I gathered the specials were supposed to be my bodyguard. Christ, the hospital staff went through the book on me. X-rays, and just about everything you could think of. After much pulling and pushing me around, they treated the few minor grazes I had and diagnosed concussion. To be precise, mild concussion, they said. What the hell happened? I asked Jenny when I finally began to get my head together. "I thought Harris said that car didn't move." "Apparently it didn't," Jenny replied. "It was a different car completely. From what the special constable says, just about every available policeman in the county is out looking for it now." "What? They lost the bleeding thing?" "Well, we assume so. It was out of sight before Bert got his car out of the pub car park," Jenny replied. Helen, who had said nothing, was sitting on the other side of the bed, and I suddenly became aware that she was holding my hand. Actually, it was only when I went to scratch my nose that I realized that I didn't have a free hand to do it with. Jenny was holding my other hand. That was a big problem for me. Which hand did I release to scratch my nose? After thinking about it for a couple of moments, I decided to let my nose itch. It was taking my mind off of the other aches and pains and the damned headache I had. I wouldn't want to upset either woman. Thoughtful bugger, ain't I? Then a doctor and nurse came in. I think the doctor was the guy who'd been in charge of my treatment earlier. "Sorry, ladies. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the patient alone. The best treatment for concussion is rest and sleep. So we're going to administer a sedative now." Great, I thought to myself. I'm the bleeding patient, and he's telling the girls what he's going to do before he even asks me whether I want a sedative. I discovered later that I'd been more out of it than I thought, and had been what that medical staff kindly refers to as a difficult patient. Apparently, I'd assured everybody that I was fine and that I was going home. I'm not too sure that the sedative worked that well at first. Perhaps there was a lot of adrenaline still in my system and interfered with the result the doc was expecting. During the night, I woke up several times when the nurses came in to check on me. And that damned beep, beep, beep of those machines that they'd apparently hooked me up to got really up my nose. At one time, I thought I heard raised voices. I believe they were Helen's and Jenny's, and I got the distinct impression they were putting Gary Harris through the mill. But then I heard a female voice tell them to be quiet, and after that there was silence, and I must have fallen into a deeper sleep. I had strange dreams about that car coming at me, during which I tried again to see the driver's face, but it was just too dark. Then I had the strangest dream that I was moving. I mean, my bed was moving and I could hear people talking, but nothing of what they said made any sense to me. There were bright lights and strange humming noises, things that I could hear and I was aware of through my eyelids, but I couldn't open my eyes to see. When I finally awoke, I was immediately aware that I was in a completely different room. Just to make life more interesting, hovering in front of my face were the biggest pair of jugs that I'd seen in years, all nicely wrapped up in a nurse's uniform. That's possibly a lie. Jenny carries one impressive pair of Bristols. Anyway, you don't wake up to that kind of view every morning. Well, not when you've just spent 7 years in the pokey, you don't. The nurse was fiddling with something above my head on the bed's headboard. I'm not sure why I did it, maybe devilment, or it could have been that I wasn't thinking straight from whatever drugs they'd put in my. That's my excuse anyway. I lifted my head just slightly, and it brought my mouth close enough to just give one of those beauties a little nip. Ouch! The nurse shouted and jumped back from the bed. Ah, he's awake. Jenny's voice came from somewhere in the room at the same time as the retreating body of the nurse allowed me to see Helen sitting in a chair by the bed. Oops, very bad timing, John. There's only 2 women in the world who give a damn about you at the moment, and they are both here in the room when you take a nip at another woman's jugs, I thought to myself. Mr. Smith, the nurse said, with what I took to be a chastising, but at the same time laughing tone to her voice. That's our John. What did he do, bite you? Jenny said. Saucy bugger sure did. The nurse replied with humor in her voice. That'll teach you to put temptation in John's way. With a figure like you've got, I'll bet a lot of the patients appreciate them, Helen said to the nurse. That struck me as an out-of-character sort of thing for Helen to say, somehow. They normally try to grab them, not eat the bloody things, the nurse replied, still laughing. I'm sorry, I thought you were someone else, I said, trying to placate everyone. If you think we're going to believe that, you're very much mistaken, you randy little bugger. Jenny replied to me. You'd better warn the other nurses to watch themselves around this one, she directed at the nurse. How are you feeling, John? Helen was by now standing over me. Like shit. What in the hell happened? Your brain swelled up because of that bump you took on the head. You've been unconscious for over a week. A very concerned-looking Helen informed me. I looked over at Jenny, who was by now standing close to the bed as well. I had the greatest difficulty in understanding what Jenny was trying to tell me with her eyes and eyebrows. She seemed to be looking in Helen's direction and raising her eyebrows at the same time as her mouth went into silly, contorted little smiles. There was a message there somewhere. I knew it. But I was buggered if could understand it. The nurse had left the room, but she very soon returned accompanied by a doctor, who chased Helen and Jenny out before he and the nurse put me through the ringer, both mentally and physically. Okay, Mr. Smith, I should think you better spend another day or so in bed, just to make sure things have settled down all right, and then you can go home. But take things quietly for a while, please, the doctor said before he and the nurse left the room. Almost immediately, Helen and Jenny returned, accompanied by Ronnie. Ronnie was the first to speak. What the hell did you think you were playing at, John? Letting yourself get set up like that? You know, I'm sure. We've got a pretty good claim against the police for conning you into a stupid arraignment like that. Should be worth $500,000 at least. More if you play the injured soldier bit long enough. Ronnie's solicitor's mind had been at work. No, Ronnie, no one is getting sued over this. It was partly my idea to try to draw whoever it was out anyway. Just bad luck that they lost the damned car, that's all. What's the story on the car anyway? The thing turned up burnt out just like the others, Helen replied. John, it looks like someone was preparing to do you an injury anyway. Gary thinks the Ford Mondeo that was stolen in Richmond was a blind to keep the police occupied. The car that ran you down had been stolen several weeks ago, before you got out of jail. You're not going to believe this, but it was clocked by a speed camera on the A40 the morning you were released from prison. That's interesting. Does Gary think they were intending to have a go at me outside the scrubs? I asked. He hasn't actually said, but it would be a bloody stupid thing for anyone to try. What with all those reporters who were hanging around outside there, Helen suggested. Maybe that's why they didn't try that day, I observed. Anyway, Gary arranged to have you moved into this private wing, and there's 2 armed policemen on duty outside all the time, Helen informed me. Would that have anything to do with why everybody is calling me Mr. Smith? Yeah, sorry, it was the first name that jumped into my mind that night of the accident, Jenny said. I was trying to think ahead. I'll admit I was thinking about reporters to start with, but Gary said it's probably best to keep you incognito. You know, just in case Simmons tries to find you. Between Jenny and Helen, who apparently between them had been doing the bedside vigil bit whilst I'd been sedated, told me that Curtis had been under police observation at the time the attempt on my life had been made, although the police were convinced that he stole the Mondeo Gia that they had been watching that evening. So the police, in the form of Gary Harris and his psychic Frank, thought Curtis was aware that the attempt to kill me was planned for that evening. Harris had questioned Curtis about his movements that day, but they had no evidence against him at all. It was just speculation and suspicion. The guy hadn't been fazed in the slightest when they pulled him in. Curtis also claimed that he hadn't seen me outside his office. I don't know why it hadn't occurred to Harris that Curtis must have been in contact with Simmons somehow. I thought it was most likely by mobile phone. I know that Harris had arranged for Curtis's registered mobile to be tracked. Whenever he made or received a call on it, records of whatever cell he was in were being kept. But back at that time, it was quite easy to lay your hands on an untraceable mobile. Come to think of it, it's still as if you know how. So there was the distinct possibility that Curtis had a second one. Harris and Frank came in the following morning and confirmed the tracking. They still hadn't been able to locate where Bill Simmons, Angela, and my children were. They didn't think it was a good idea for them to go public with missing persons appeal on Angela and the children because we still didn't know how Simmons would react. I think we better have him have another go at me, I suggested. Not a chance in hell. Christ, you only survived by the skin of your teeth last time, Harris said. Well, the bugger was one step ahead of us last time. This time I'll be better prepared. Anyway, if the car that ran me down was stolen before I got out of the nick, that suggests to me that he was going to have a go at me anyway. I'm buggered if I'm spending the rest of my life looking over my bleeding shoulder. You have a point, Harris said. I can only keep these guys on you for a finite period of time. Someone will start asking questions about the amount of overtime before long. What have you got in mind, John? The same as the first time, but under my rules. I'll lean on Curtis, but without you lot looking over my shoulder. What do you mean when you say lean? Inspector, you put me inside with some right dodgy buggers. Well, I made myself a few friends amongst them whilst I was there, and I did some of them a few of favors. Now I'm thinking I might collect, but I'll need to know you guys will not be looking over my shoulder. The 2 officers looked at each other, but didn't actually speak for some time. Then Gary Harris asked Frank if he would prefer to leave the room. Frank said he'd stay, but he needed my assurance that Curtis would walk away from any interview I had with him. I told him that I'm not a killer, but whilst I'd been inside, I'd come to understand what fear could do if it was applied correctly. If I can help it, Curtis might piss himself, but I don't intend for him to get injured, I told them. Well, not seriously anyway. That's all the little shit would need to get sympathy from a jury. I'd much rather see him rotting in a jail cell for a good few years than have him get off because he was busted up too much. I can't give you carte blanche to do anything you feel like, John, Harris warned me. Gary, you wouldn't be giving me carte blanche. You'd just be keeping out of the way. If the guys I'm hoping will help me smell a policeman, they'll disappear. I'll call you before the shit hits the fan. There was certain reluctance on both Gary and Frank's part, but they eventually agreed to call the hounds off, although they insisted that the police guards stayed on me whilst I was in the hospital. They also insisted that panic buttons were installed at the cottage. I didn't bother to inform them that I wasn't going back there for a while. After Gary and Frank left, Jenny came back into the room. I realized I'd been thinking of myself a lot and neglecting her a bit. Jenny, have you been here at the hospital ever since I got knocked down? Most of the time, yes. I had to make sure they were looking after my boy properly, she replied. What about your husband? Surely he must be pretty pissed off that you've spent so much time here. Screw him. He's history. I caught him with that little 304 in my bloody bed. I hope you don't mind. I moved into one of the spare rooms of the cottage for the time being. Helen helped me. Mr. McIntosh said it would be all right. Of course it's all right. Sounds to me that you're well shot of the bugger anyway. Now, Give us a kiss, then call Ronnie and tell him to get his arse up here. I've got some things for that bugger to do before I get out of here." Helen popped in later, but she couldn't stay long because she had work to do. Ronnie turned up about 3. I asked him to drum up $5,000 in cash in another car. Then I asked him to write me a will. Well, not exactly a will. Remember, on paper I was virtually a bankrupt, but I let him know that should I not make it, he was to split my money 3 ways, 1/3 each to Jenny, Helen, and my kids. After he'd taken his commission, of course, and the children weren't to see a penny until after there was no chance Angela could get her hands on it. I also asked Ronnie to make a few calls for me, suggesting they should be made on a secure line. Ronnie got my meaning, so I knew that the calls would be made on a phone that couldn't be traced back to either of us. It was another 3 days before the doctors finally deigned to let me out of the hospital. I left in the comfort of a laundry van. Although the police were convinced that there was no one watching the hospital, I didn't think it was worth taking any chances. Helen and Jenny picked me up at a prearranged place on the road. Then they dropped me at a different and rather grand hotel. Later that evening, after I had insisted that both women leave, I had visitors. 3 rather large guys joined me in my suite. After discussing my problem for a while over a few drinks, the guys came up with a simple plan to get Curtis alone. They'd simply hire him to drive them somewhere, and then grab him when they were somewhere quiet. After a phone call or 2, they even came up with a good place for us to have our little chat. A warehouse in East London down by the river. "There's a doorway right over the river," one of the guys said. "All you got to do is talk about tide times and bodies getting washed out into the channel, and the buggers shit themselves. You've done this sort of thing before?" I casually asked, more out of making conversation than anything. "Yeah, not clever dropping bodies in the Thames though. The damn things hang around too bloody long. They keep washing backwards and forwards with the tide. Anyway, the idea is to clean the Thames up nowadays, not drop shitheads in it. You know, they found a salmon in the river the other year, and the boffins are hoping they'll breed in the river again one day." Rather a surreal conversation to be having, I thought. The disadvantages of polluting the River Thames by dropping dead bodies into it. But it turned out the guy was a keen fisherman. I did wonder, though, just where these guys did dispose of dead bodies. They certainly appeared to know the ins and outs of doing so. The rest of the evening was spent discussing old times and how the guys were getting on the outside. It was gone 4 in the morning when they finally left. I think they only left then because the booze ran out. Needless to say, I needed another of Jenny's mixtures when I finally woke the following day. Jenny had come into the room early and spotted all the empty scotch bottles, then promptly headed off to find the required ingredients. After insisting I eat a late breakfast in my room, Jenny decided it was time I had a shower, and we played a bit. The woman nearly killed me that afternoon. She claimed she'd gotten used to plenty of sex and had been missing me. Well, I don't think she was missing me so much as a certain part of my anatomy. Anyway, she damned well nearly wore it out. I couldn't get it up again no matter how much she tried. "I don't want you getting all excited around Helen tonight and scaring the poor girl away," Jenny said. Then she informed me that Helen was joining me for dinner that evening. "Johnny, that woman's got the hots for you, you know? She's a bloody good catch, and you should go after her." "Damn it, Jenny. I'm pretty sure Helen's got her eyes on Frank. What is it with you? First you say she's after Harris, and then his bloody sidekick. Johnny, she's sweet on you." "I know. I'm a woman. What makes you so convinced?" I asked, curious whether Jenny would say woman's intuition. "Well, she's bringing her children tonight, and she wouldn't do that if she wasn't after you. She's letting you and her children look each other over to see how you take to each other. And secondly, she told me when you were sedated, you can't have better than the horse's mouth." "Oh, don't tell her I told you." "I promised not to tell." "You told me after you promised her you wouldn't?" "Yes, of course. Why do you think she told me she was falling in love with you?" "I'm supposed to tell you," Jenny said with a satisfied smile on her face. "You are?" "Of course, and as I know you fancy her, we're saving a lot of time here. You be a good boy in front of the children, and before you know it, you'll be betting Helen on a permanent basis. Look, she's not a tart. I think you'll have to ask her to marry you." "Women?" "What?" Jenny asked. "Women," I said. "I'll never understand them," I replied. Actually, Jenny was quite right. I was really taken with Helen. I think I had been from the moment she first approached, or should I say the moment she proved to me that I couldn't frighten her in that motorway services. Helen arrived about 6:30. Dinner would have to be early because of the children, but before the meal all 5 of us went for a little walk in the hotel grounds. Then we went into the restaurant to eat. Helen's 2 girls were on their best behavior. I doubt that they had been in a place that grand very often. Come to that, neither had I. I don't really stand on too much ceremony. I had some fun with them by taking the mickey out of the oh-so-correct waiter. The girls giggled and Helen gave me that look that I could remember getting from Angela when I messed about with my children in public. I really believe that with Auntie Jenny's help, I hit it off quite well with the girls. Auntie Jenny had supplied me with the correct little gifts to give them. First impressions are important with children and in-laws, she'd said. As I gave the children their little presents, I discovered there was an extra little box in the bag that Jenny had given me. That proved to be a brooch for Helen. It was nothing special or very expensive. Apparently Helen had told Jenny she liked it when they'd been going around the shops together, whilst I'd been asleep, as my time in hospital was explained to the children. Officially, that was the purpose of the dinner. I was thanking the children for letting their mother spend so much time away from them, whilst she'd been at my bedside. Helen and the children didn't stay very late. After they'd left, Jenny declared the evening a success and demanded that we go into the bar for a while to celebrate. Just how do you know the children liked me? I asked Jenny. What? Not like Superman, who jumped over a car in one bound. They were awestruck. How could they not like you? Christ. If you get your own children back off of Angela, you and Helen will have a bloody house full. You'll need a governess. Do you want my application in writing now? Jenny said with a triumphant tone to her voice. Give over, Jenny. I hardly know Helen, and anyway I didn't exactly jump over that car in one bound. I bounced a bit. It was only when it got late that I realized that Jenny obviously wasn't going home that night, so we retired to bed. It was a long night punctuated by bouts of exertion. I got the cryptic phone call about 10 the following morning. Jenny wanted to come with me, but I refused to let her get involved. It took me nearly 2 hours to get to the warehouse. As I approached, a large door was opened so that I could drive inside, so my vehicle was out of sight. One of my friends met me and led me through several other warehouses until we got to one that must have been right by the river. Parked in the middle of the warehouse was Curtis' car. I was led over to a small office built against the wall on the riverside of the warehouse. All right, mate, the guy who had planned all this said as I entered the office. He had 2 gorillas with him, who would have scared the shit out of anyone who met them on a dark night. He's been stewing in the boot since just after midnight. The boys have been standing by the car talking about how we are going to dispose of his body. I reckon he'll be ready to tell us anything for the chance to get out of here alive. Now we've checked that he won't be able to see you in here, but you should be able to hear him. We'll check with you in case there's anything we don't cover. Right, Marco, let's get the ball rolling. The 2 gorillas and my friend left the office. They went over to the Merc, opened the boot, and dragged a terrified-looking Curtis out of it. The beginning of the end. The 2 gorillas and my friend left the office. They went over to the Merc, opened the car's boot, and dragged a terrified-looking Curtis out of it. My friends had come up with what I thought was a pretty strange plan on how to get the information we wanted out of Curtis. But I should imagine that the experts at the Met, at one time or another during their lives, had questioned them all. So those experts had effectively trained them. Only normally they'd have been on the receiving end of the questions. Okay, arsehole, where is he? Gorilla 1 demanded. Who? I don't know who you're looking for, Curtis blurted out. I could see that the guy was shaking with fear. He didn't know who these guys were, but one look at them told him they were in a different league to any criminals he'd mixed with in the past. My friend, who had had his back to Curtis, turned now and looked him in the eye. Where is Johnny Carpenter? My friend said with real venom in his voice. Curtis was physically taken aback by the question. He'd obviously expected that he was going to be asked about Simmons, but these guys were asking him about me. A look of complete confusion came over his face. John Carpenter? I haven't seen him since his trial. Curtis eventually lied. I don't think Curtis even knew where the blow came from. I only just caught sight of Gorilla 2's quick movement. Curtis doubled up on the floor, the breath knocked out of him by the punch to his stomach. Don't you lie to the boss. Gorilla 1 said, Carpenter was at your office the other day. What did he want? Curtis, who had been staring at the size 9 boots that were only a couple of inches from his face, looked up at the gorilla. I don't know what he wanted. I didn't speak to him. Then why was he there? The boss asked. I don't know. I told you. He's probably after me because I grassed him up in court. No chance, Gorilla once said, dragging Curtis from the floor by his lapels. You'd be floating in that bleedin' river by now. If Johnny Carpenter was after your blood. Now tell us, what did Carpenter want with a little shit like you? The plan here was for Curtis to get the idea that these guys weren't looking for Simmons at all. If he thought that they were looking for me, Curtis might be more likely to let slip where Simmons could be found and get himself out of the obvious jam he found himself in. I don't know. I told you. I just gave evidence against him in court a few years ago. I figured the guy was gonna work me over. I got out of there as quickly as I could. I ain't seen the bugger since. Bollocks. If Johnny Carpenter were really after you, you wouldn't be alive for us to talk to. Johnny Carpenter doesn't play games. So what did he want you to do for him, and where has he gone now? The boss asked the now quivering Curtis. I told you, I never spoke to him. I think he was trying to put the frightness on me. Why would he want to do that? The boss asked. I'm not sure. Perhaps he's looking for his missus. She ran off on him, you know? Tell me more. If he's looking for her, then that's probably where we'll find him. But why would he think you knew where his missus was anyway? I don't know where she is. I think she's shacked up with the husband of the woman Carpenter knocked off. That's all I know, Curtis gasped out. Curtis was sounding even more desperate now, as Gorilla 2 had produced a jimmy from somewhere and was taping it against the palm of his hand. Curtis was eyeing the thing thoughtfully. I think he knows a lot more than he's telling us, boss, Gorilla number 2 said. Let me teach him a little respect. What? Like the last time? That little shit was too busted up to say much at all once you'd finished with him, Gorilla 1 commented. I got carried away. I'll only break a few bones here and there. You'll still be able to talk. Bring him over here where I got some room. No, look, I don't know nothing, I promise. Curtis almost screamed. He was in panic by then. Don't lie to me, kid, the boss said in a very calm but firm voice. You obviously know about Carpenter's wife and who she's shacked up with. Now that ain't exactly common knowledge, so tell me how the hell you know about it. Or you and that car of yours is gonna rot away in the bottom of that dock out there. No 304 will ever find you down there. I really thought Curtis's eyes were going to pop out of his head as he looked at each of the 3 men in turn, and then he just fainted. They let him fall to the floor, but quite gently. Then whilst 2 gorillas stood over him, the boss came and joined me in the office. Every time the little shit opens his mouth, he tells us a little bit more, the boss said to me. By the time we get out of here tonight, we're going to know everything he does. I think it's best we try to find out where Simmons is holed up first, and then we'll see what he says about your frame-up. Sound good to you? I'm surprised you've only hit him once, I commented. Kicking the shit out of them is quite satisfying, but fear is a far more useful tool. Once you start knocking them about, there's a chance that you do the buggers a serious injury, then they go unconscious on you, and you're screwed. Bernie only gave him one little tap, and the rest is down to the little shit's imagination. The boss picked up a chair that was in the office and carried it back out to where Curtis was laying. The 2 gorillas picked up Curtis and sat him in the chair. Then one of them slapped him around the face a couple of times. Curtis opened his eyes and looked around as if he didn't know where he was. Then suddenly it dawned on him he was still in his worst nightmare. Just for a moment I thought he was going to try to make a run for it. Then he seemed to change his mind. Right, you were telling me about this guy that Carpenter's old lady is shacked up with. Where can I find him? The boss demanded menacingly. Honest, I don't know. Down near Southampton somewhere, I think. And what makes you say that? The boss asked in a much more gentle tone of voice. I got the idea of what he was up to. When Curtis was answering his questions, the boss sounded quite amicable. If Curtis didn't come up with the answers, the boss and the 2 gorillas sounded quite terrifying. Curtis didn't answer for a few seconds. I believe he was thinking whether he dared lie to this man. Then after looking at the 2 gorillas again, he explained. Every so often Simmons calls me and asks me to steal a car for him. I don't think he's got the guts to nick one for himself. I nick one from in town somewhere, and then leave it in a car park down in Southampton for him to collect. What does he want stolen cars for? Don't know, don't ask. He pays up front. That's all I worry about. but he's gotta live down that way somewhere to pick the cars up. And normally my cash turns up in the mail with a Southampton postmark. He pays you in cash through the post? Yeah, the money's normally in a cassette case or something, stuffed into one of those padded envelopes. How come he's got you nicking cars for him? I done a job for him some time back, and since then he's been getting me to nick the odd car now and again for him. What job did you do for him? Curtis again looked at the three big men standing around him. Look, you don't like Carpenter, so it can't hurt telling you. Simmons fitted Carpenter up for his wife's murder. I swiped a bottle of champagne and a couple of glasses from the hotel and gave them to Simmons. Then somehow he got Carpenter's fingerprints on them and put them back in his wife's room the night she was murdered. She always had champagne when she met her boyfriends in the hotel, so Simmons knew she would order a bottle. I delivered the champagne when she called down for it and told the police I'd seen Carpenter in the room with her. Who was in the room with her? No one when I delivered the champagne. There never was when she ordered the champagne. Curtis stopped talking as if thinking about something. Only, I suppose there could have been someone hiding in the bathroom. She never invited me to stay that night. Normally, she would make some suggestion. You'd never taken her up on her suggestion then? Only once, when I don't think her fella turned up. Look, I was working. I couldn't disappear into her room all bleeding night. Just one night her bloke never showed, and she waited until I was off duty. Christ, the woman was a sex machine. What about these boyfriends of hers? Did you ever see them? No chance. I think that's why she used the place. There are no security cameras, well, not back then. I think her dates came up the fire escape. It was right outside the window of that room she always used. I don't think anyone in the hotel ever saw them. The boss surreptitiously looked over in my direction. I think he had run out of questions, and he was wondering if I had any more. To tell you the truth, I couldn't think of any at that moment. My mind was elsewhere. I'd been racking my brain some, and I'd remembered that about a year before Mary Simmons was murdered, Angela's auntie, her only living relative, as far as I knew, had gotten so old and frail she'd moved into a care home. The old girl had a house somewhere down near Dibden, right on the edge of the New Forest. I'd only been there once, but I had a vague memory of where the place was located. I had begun to wonder whether the old lady had died and Angela had inherited the house. As I remembered it, the house was pretty isolated, just the kind of place to hide out in, no neighbors living close by or anything, to see who came and went, and from there, it was only a stone's throw to Southampton. Suddenly I realized my friend the boss was in the office with me. Anything else you can think of? He asked. No, but I've got an idea where I might find Angela and my kids. Can you sit on the little shit for a few hours whilst I go down to the New Forest to check it out? If he gets to a telephone, Curtis might get in contact with Simmons. Simmons ain't as daft as this little bugger. He might put two and two together. Aren't you going to call the cops in? No, I don't think so. Well, not yet anyway. It's only a hunch, and if they send the local cops nosing around, God knows what Simmons would do. He's killed before. He might panic and use my kids as hostages or something. I want to go down and get my kids out of there before the shit hits the fan. But I thought you said he had a cast iron alibi for his wife's murder. Well, he paid that little shit Curtis off. What's to say he didn't pay off the people who gave him that alibi? Then there's my friend's father, and Simmons had a go at me the other night, remember? Sit on this little bugger for a few hours until after I've checked out the place I'm thinking of, at least. Then I noticed that I couldn't see Curtis in the warehouse. Where is he, anyway? The boys stuck him back in the boot of his car. He's safe enough in there for a while. I should think he's getting used to it by now. He's been in there most of the night. But you aren't going down there on your own. Bernie and me are coming along, just in case you get into trouble. Marco can babysit Laughing Boy here. 10 minutes later, we were on the road. I called up Gary after we got past Winchester and told him I was heading for the house where I thought Angela and my kids were staying. Gary was not a happy policeman and told me not to do anything stupid. He and Frank were in their car chasing after me before I'd finished my conversation with him. But I had a good hour or so head start on him, and he didn't know what car I was driving, so he couldn't put the local cops onto me. We parked up about a mile from the house and waited until dark. I'd taken the precaution of turning my mobile off because I didn't want Gary tracing my general location from its signal. Bernie and the boss sat there taking swigs from a hip flask. They were extraordinarily relaxed about it. They told me that you soon learned to remain calm after you'd waited for the right time to pull a job heist a few times. Once it was dark, we drove the car closer to the house and parked down a track where it couldn't be seen from the road. I hunted around in the boot for a wheel brace or something to use for protection, since Simmons was a bigger guy than I was. Bernie gave me his Jimmy. It was short and heavy, just the thing I was looking for. The boss and Bernie came with me until we got close to the house. There were lights on, but the drapes were drawn on all the downstairs rooms except the kitchen. There was no one in the kitchen, so I tried the back door. Surprisingly, it was unlocked. But then again, a lot of people who live in the country don't lock their doors when they are in the house. I told the boys to wait outside whilst I went in and had a snoop around. Then I crept inside. The house was almost completely silent. The passage that led off the kitchen was in darkness, but I could make out the low drone of a TV or radio coming from a room at the other end of it that I assumed was the lounge. The door to the lounge was not fully closed, so I quietly crept along the passage and looked through the crack between the door and the jamb. The room appeared to be empty at first sight, so I pushed the door very gently to open the gap a little and enlarge my field of vision. I just got to the point where I could see a man's foot on the floor when then everything went black. The Last Dance. The room appeared to be empty at first sight, so I very gently pushed the door to open the gap a little and enlarge my field of vision. I just got to the point where I could see a man's foot on the floor when everything went black. As I slowly regained my senses, I discovered that I was lying on the floor of the room I'd been trying to peer into. I had a pain in my head that informed me I'd been struck on the back of it. How long I'd been unconscious, I had no idea. Slowly, my eyes focused on the inert body lying before me. As my mind and vision cleared, I realized that it was Bill Simmons who lying there not a couple of feet from me. I think I lifted myself onto one elbow to get a better look and convince myself that I was correct in the impression I'd had that he was dead. Yes, John, he is dead. Angela's voice came from behind me somewhere. Stunned, I looked around to see her sitting on the other side of the room, holding an automatic pistol in her hand. What happened? I asked, not really knowing if I was asking about Simmons or what had hit me. Or rather, as far as the police will be concerned, you shot him. Angela replied. Yeah, I think that it shouldn't be too difficult to convince them that you came here looking for revenge on Bill for stealing your once loving wife away from you. You had a gun and were intent on killing both of us. You shot Bill first, but unfortunately for you, he had a gun in the desk here. I managed to get to it whilst you had an altercation with Bill, and in panic I shot you in self-defense. It wasn't quite the way I'd planned things originally, but it serves the same purpose. You'll both be dead, and it'll save me organizing an accident for Bill later. I know that what Angela had said did register in my befuddled brain, but I had other things I was worried about. Where are the children, Angela? I demanded. Don't worry about them, John. They're in a nice boarding school in Kent, quite safely out of the way. You won't get away with killing Bill or me that easily, Angela. Oh, I think I will. I've had time to think this out. This gun is an automatic, and as far as the police know, I never fired a gun in my life before. I intend to spray bullets all over the room in a very random fashion. I've thought about this carefully. It will be one of those random shots that will kill you. It'll be an accident, of course, just a poor, frightened, defenseless, panicking housewife defending herself from a very jealous, vicious murderer of a husband who's already been convicted of killing Mary Simmons. I think I can convince a jury of that, even if I can't convince the police. But why? What's the point in all this? Why was it necessary to kill Mary and frame me for it in the first place? You and Bill Simmons could have just run off together. Oh, Johnny, you never did understand me, did you? I didn't give a shit for Bill Simmons. Christ, he was never very good in bed. I can assure you of that. Hey, maybe that's why Mary was always running around on him. You see, Johnny, it was the money I always wanted. With all of Mary's money as well as yours, I can enjoy the nice life I've always dreamed of down in the south of France. Is that what all this was about? Money? You and Simmons framed me and sent me to prison for 7 years, just so that you could get your hands on Mary's money. I'm sorry, darling, but that's about it. I was bored and I wanted to live the high life. There wasn't much sense in having you bumped off. I couldn't have lived the life I've always wanted on what you had. Suddenly it struck me that if I hadn't safely squirreled all that money away abroad, I could have been the one who got killed in the first place. Angela had always been a spendthrift, so I'd siphoned off as much as I could get away with to avoid arguments over her excesses. You know, at one time I did think about taking out a big life insurance policy on you, John, Angela continued, but I'm pretty sure that would have made the police suspicious if you'd suddenly turned up dead. And then poor old dumb Bill there started making passes at me. You know he had nothing. It was all Mary's money, so it wasn't too difficult to talk him into it. So you planned it all? Yes, you didn't think Bill there had the brains or the nerve to murder Mary, did you? Christ, Angela, you stabbed Mary Simmons? Holy shit, you killed Sheila Thomas and George Caffrey as well. And it was you who tried to run me down the other day. That's why I couldn't see who was driving the car that night. You were so low down in the seat. Yeah, the girls at school always did call me short arse. You know you're not going to get away with this, Angela. Not this time. I was stalling for time by then. I reckon the boss and Bernie couldn't be far away. I don't know why actually, but I had the distinct impression that they were outside the door in the passage. The problem was Angela was sitting on the other side of the room, away from the door, and she had a gun pointing at me. Oh, I think I will. John Carpenter, the convicted murderer, gets let out of jail and hunts down his ex-wife and her new love. I can see the headlines in the Sunday papers now. I should imagine that I'll lay my hands on whatever money you had left after the divorce as well. After all, the children are your next of kin. That, and all Mary's money that Dumbo Bill here put in numbered Swiss bank accounts. I've got all the numbers and passwords, by the way. Angela waved a piece of paper she was holding in her other hand at me. Bill was hopeless at paperwork. I should be set up very nicely for the rest of my life. Thank you. There's one thing I don't understand, Angela. Why did you wait until I got out of jail? Why didn't you and Simmons just run off and disappear whilst I was in prison? Darling, Bill was a dumb idiot. That's one thing that I knew you never were. Except when I married you. I cut in. Whoa, that wasn't a very nice thing for a loving husband to say, John, Angela said with a weird smile on her face. Anyway, I knew that you'd track me down one day. You're no fool, although it was a bit stupid of you to come sneaking around here on your own. Anyway, I had no intention of spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for you to be standing there. One day, I knew that if I attempted to move or stand up, Angela would probably shoot me straight away. I had to distract her somehow and keep her talking long enough for the boss and Bernie to realize what was going to happen and, I hoped, do something about it. I put my hand to the back of my head and felt the large bump there where I assumed Angela had hit me and knocked me out. Jesus Christ, girl. What the hell did you hit me with? I asked as I did so. A wooden rolling pin, the normal little woman's weapon. Remember, I'm just a scared little housewife who married a crazed killer. What was that? Angela asked, as there was a distinct noise outside the window. That was my cue to be ready to move. I figured that the boss or Bernie was trying to divert Angela's attention. Then suddenly the whole damned window burst inwards. I was to find out later that Bernie and the boss had thrown a garden bench seat through it. As best I could, I tried to dive behind the couch, but at almost the same instant Angela fired the gun in my direction. The damned bullet must have come through the arm of the sofa and hit me a glancing blow on the side of my head, although I never felt the impact. I just had vague memories of someone, who I later discovered was Gary, shouting, "Armed police, put your weapon down or I'll shoot." Then all hell broke loose and there were a multitude of gunshots that appeared to be coming from all around me. Then silence. I'm not sure if I was unconscious or not, but I lost track of things after that for a little while. Then I was suddenly aware of the boss asking, "Johnny, are you okay?" I opened my eyes and looked up at him bending over me. "Don't move. You've been shot in the head," he said as he studied my head for a couple of moments. "Oh, don't panic. It looks like nothing more than a graze. The ambulance is on its way." "Angela?" I asked. "She's dead, John. I'm afraid I had to shoot her." Gary's voice came from somewhere. "I'm sorry, Gary," I said, knowing that killing people isn't what a man like him joined the police to do. "I did my firearms training, John. I'm certified to carry a gun, and I've always known there was an outside chance that I'd have to shoot someone one day. I never thought it would be a woman, though. Christ, this is going to be a bloody mess. I had to use your friend here's gun." Look, you two had better make yourselves scarce before the local boys turn up, Gary said, turning his attention to the boss and Bernie. We'll have to come up with some story about me finding this gun in the house here. Damn, I should be nicking you for carrying the blooding thing. You know that's a 5-year stretch, don't you? The boss and Bernie looked at Gary and nodded. Oh, and if this gun turns up with a forensic match for any other crimes, I'll be after you like greased lightning. No chance. It's clean, that I can assure you of that, the boss replied. Picked it up myself, brand new in the States last year. Then after taking my car keys, they were out of the house in an instant. What a mess, Gary said, turning his attention back to me. He studied my head wound and agreed with the boss that it only looked like a graze. The ambulance and the local police seemed to take forever to arrive. Luckily in a way, because it gave Gary, Frank, and myself time to get our story sounding convincing. Gary had heard all of what Angela had said. It had been him whose presence I'd sensed outside the door. Apparently Curtis had somehow escaped. Marco, the guy who was supposed to be guarding him, had called the boss and warned him that Curtis might ring Simmons. So the boss, thinking things could be getting out of hand, had used my mobile that I'd left in the car to call Gary and Frank. It turned out that Gary had a damned good memory. When he learned I'd been heading for Southampton area to find Angela, he'd reached back into his mind and vaguely remembered Angela saying her only living relative lived in the New Forest, from when he interviewed her during the investigation into Mary Simmons' murder. Apparently, when I'd been arrested, he'd suggested that Angela call a relative to be with her, and Angela had mentioned that the only relative she had living was in an old folks' care home down there. Anyway, that had been enough for Gary and Frank to head for the general area of the forest. By chance, when the boss had called them, they hadn't been that far away. The boss and Bernie had been in the house and had spotted Angela sitting there pointing a gun at my inert body before Gary and Frank arrived. Apparently Gary was all for going in unarmed, but the boss, placing himself in danger of arrest for even possessing a handgun, had offered Gary his. I don't know whether Gary or I will ever get our heads around what the boss did that day. The boss is a well-known career criminal, well-known in certain parts of London. That is, for him to pull out an illegal weapon and give it to a police officer for his own and my protection was probably inviting a stretch at Her Majesty's pleasure. However, Gary, for his own reasons, decided not to pursue the boss for his action. Luckily, several other guns were found in the house when the police searched it. All of them were clearly related to Angela in one way or another. They were hidden amongst her clothes and things. So apparently no one asked too many questions about the one that Gary had supposedly found in the kitchen. I was dragged off to the hospital where I was kept overnight and had several stitches put into the wound in my head. Helen and Jenny turned up to see me there, and they both tore me off a strip for going after Angela and Simmons on my own. We managed to dodge the press when we left hospital. So it was some time and things had cooled down a bit before they discovered where the cottage was. They turned up again around the time of the inquests, but seemed to lose interest pretty quickly. Mind you, they were a bloody nuisance when the hardest job I had to undertake became due. I had to get my girls from that boarding school and tell them that their mother was dead. This was made even harder by the fact that Angela and Simmons had told them that I was dead. The children hating that damn school made things slightly easier. But even so, I don't know if I could have done it without Helen and Jenny's help, and the help of the local police who kept the press and sightseers away from the cottage as much as they could. The boss laid on what he liked to call some security as well, and that also proved handy around the local school when the children started going there. Jenny, who was living at my house by then, remember, played governess to the children, and to Helen's children as well, when she brought them with her on her regular visits. The appeals court threw out my conviction for murder surprisingly quickly. Well, they had to do that before I could get custody of my children back. Gary's testimony of what Angela had said that day saw to that. Curtis vanished into thin air, but Gary reckons that he'll show up sometime. If nothing else, the little shit faces charges for perverting the course of justice and perjury. Gary's not sure he can get accessory to murder charges to stick for stealing the cars that Angela used. The sex between Jenny and I had cooled down considerably by then, but there were occasions when she sneaked into my room during the night while the children were asleep. However, as time went on, it became apparent to Helen and me that there was someone else interested in Jenny's charms, and it soon became obvious that the interest wasn't completely one-sided. Bert, One of the police officers who'd been on bodyguard duty at the hotel took to showing up in his patrol car and having coffee with Ginny. Ginny tells me that until all the children are old enough, she doesn't intend to accept Bert's offer of marriage. Hell, she refused to actually go out with Bert until her divorce was final. Oh, she hasn't stipulated how old enough is either. Helen and me, well, we're getting on just fine. She moved in with her children a few months after everything had cooled down, and we have talked about tying the knot. I think that both having been severely bitten once, we're quite happy to take our time about things. One last point. Mary Simmons' money and where the hell it went to. Angela had waved that piece of paper under my nose that she claimed had the numbers of those Swiss bank accounts on. Somehow it had disappeared from the house that night. It was nearly a year later when the boss paid me an unexpected visit one morning. He suggested a walk in the garden, and when we got down near the pond, he produced that piece of paper. Now, I didn't give this to you earlier because we needed to let things calm down a bit. All there needed to be was another one of these lists in the house somewhere, and the law would have been all over you when you tried to access the accounts. I'd leave it a bit longer before you move the money about, and don't move too much at once. Good luck, my boy, and thanks for what you did for me on the inside. I never have discovered what I was supposed to have done for the boss whilst I was in the nick. Life goes on. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.